Welcome back. What a terrific keynote we all were treated to. Thanks again, Chris. And now I have the pleasure of sharing the second panel on Angleton and his times with Loch Johnson, Alek Kugan, and David Martin. Randall Woods from the University of Arkansas, unfortunately, cannot be with us this afternoon, so we have a little bit more time for the presentations and for the discussion. Let me introduce the speakers briefly and then turn it over to them. So, Loch Johnson is Regents Professor at the School of Public and International Affairs at the University of Georgia. From 1975 to 1976, he served as Special Assistant to the Chairman of the Select Committee on Intelligence and as Staff Director of the House Subcommittee on Intelligence Oversight from 1977 to 79. In 2005, he was invited to Yale University as a visiting scholar. During his time at the University of Georgia, he won the Owens Award, its highest honor for research, as well as the Josiah Meigs Prize, which is the university's highest teaching honor. He has authored a number of books, including the Handbook of Intelligence Studies, the Oxford Handbook of National Security Intelligence, The Threat on the Horizon, an inside account of America's search for security after the Cold War, and National Security Intelligence, Secret Operations in Defense of the Democracies. He's also the editor of the well-known journal Intelligence and National Security. It's a great pleasure to have you with us and to give you the floor.
Thank you, Chris, very much. Let me add my compliments to the organizers. This is such a wonderful event to have a conference on Angleton. I never thought I'd see one, but it really has been fun and so well organized, so thank you. You know, when you follow Chris Andrew, you can't help but feel a little bit like the Bulgarian tumbling act that followed the Beatles on the Ed Sullivan Show. I intend to focus my remarks on my relationship with Jim Angleton from 1975 to 1976, the years I served as an assistant to Senator Frank Church as he led an inquiry into allegations of illegal CIA domestic spying. The setting in Washington at the time included a resurgent Congress, which had resolved to halt the erosion of its powers at the hands of the imperial presidency. In the lead-up to the spy scandal, congressional oversight of America's intelligence agencies was minimal. Allen Dulles once told a journalist that the only person he would tell about America's intelligence operations was the president, if he asked. The Congress was certainly not in his equation. Even when a later DCI, Jim Schlesinger, went up to the Hill quite conscientiously and attempted to inform overseers about CIA operations, a senior Senator John Stennis of Mississippi said to him, "No, no, my boy, don't tell me. I don't want to know." After Watergate and Vietnam, however, lawmakers took steps toward restoring the reputation of Congress as a co-equal branch of government. In the middle of this institutional uprising came the stunning charges of CIA spying at home. The chief counsel of the Church Committee asked me to examine the CIA's approach to counterintelligence and to prepare a hearing in which Angleton would be the star witness. In preparation for this daunting assignment, the lamb sets out to interrogate the lion. I did all the research I could on the mysterious head of the CIA staff, a unit which Bill Colby once referred to as the most secret of all agency crannies. I soon had the impression that if ever there were a Renaissance man, Angleton would fit the bill. On a darker side, though, I also learned that he had been deeply involved in the Houston Plan and the illegal mail opening operations. Angleton and I met downtown at the Army-Navy Club, a favorite haunt of his at the time, starting in July of 1975, for the first of many extended interviews. After we ordered lunch, I halfway expected him to pull out of his vest pocket a packet of tarot cards, But instead, he began the conversation by informing me about the central mission of counterintelligence, which was, he said, to construct a wilderness of mirrors in which the opponent would be confused and forever lost. Exactly what he thought the Soviets were achieving against the West. Angleton's responses to my question lacked all semblance of linear narrative. And I have an appreciation for Colby's verdict in his memoir that the CIA chief's explanations were, quote, impossible to follow, unquote. Or as Mark Twain might have put it, listening to Angleton for a half hour could make one dizzy. Listening to him for a full hour could make one drunk. Following each lunch, we shifted from the dining room to the library of the Army-Navy Club. There, Angleton smoked Merit cigarettes at that time, Virginia Slims later, I guess, and continued his tutorial, while with his permission, I wrote down virtually every word he said during these sessions. Here are some of the things he said. Frank Church has never understood counterintelligence. His innocence about the world exceeds that of an unborn child. Doesn't he realize the Soviets seek to destroy American intelligence? What will it take to wake him up? Church's objective is transparent, to fashion a statutory straitjacket for the agency. Then at great length, Angleton began to unfold his counterintelligence theories. He said, for example, each day the KGB tries to infiltrate the Western intelligence services, and they have had great success. And what has been at the center of the Kremlin strategy against the West? Deception operations designed to destabilize and weaken members of NATO. After one of our lunches and another lengthy treatise on counterintelligence, he slouched back into his chair in the library and stared at me in silence for a full minute. Then he said, how many senior officials at the CIA are part of the Soviets' efforts? I stared back at him for a while. He stood up abruptly, put on his black trench coat, black scarf, and black Homburg. Angleton was Gothic before Gothic, and marched out of the room. A couple of weeks prior to the Church Committee's public hearing with Angleton, my assignment was to question him under oath for the record. After more than 2 hours, I wound down the session with a final query. I said, was the CIA bound by all of the government's overt orders, or might the agency be given a separate and contrary set of covert directives? I expected him to say something to the effect that this sometimes happens, although only with the clear approval of the White House and intelligence managers. Instead, as he was putting his papers together, he replied, and I'm quoting, "It is inconceivable that a secret intelligence arm of the government has to comply with all the overt orders of the government." Years later, when Yale historian Robin Winks looked back at this episode, he suggested that Angleton was saying that there might well be overt orders from the government which would be countermanded by covert ones. This was my interpretation at the time as well. However, much to Angleton's anguish, that would not be the interpretation of a few senators when our hearings were held. The curtain rose on the CIA counterintelligence hearings on the morning of September 24th, 1975. Angleton, and we've all seen the photograph, looked dazed and acutely uncomfortable in front of all the bright lights and television cameras. Frank Church gavelled the meeting to order and began a cross-examination on the subject of illegal CIA mail opening. One of the chairman's conclusion when he reminded Angleton that President Nixon had thought he had closed down the mail opening program, only to find out, all of us much later, that it had continued on. Church concluded, so the commander-in-chief is not the commander-in-chief at all. He is just a problem. You do not want to inform him in the first place because he might say no. That is the truth of it. And when he did say no, you disregarded it. Then you call him the commander-in-chief. Angleton attempted a rebuttal, and I'm quoting him. From a counterintelligence point of view, it was vitally important to know everything possible about contacts between U.S. citizens and communist countries. At the Army-Navy Club a few days before, he had said to me that the CIA had opened the mail of only a fraction of letter writers in the United States. Some 215,000 instances, which he quickly added, represented 0.001% of the American population. And he went on to say, this included people who were involved in criminal fraternization with the enemy. Now, in the public hearing, he lamented that the nature of the threat posed by the Soviet Union was insufficiently appreciated. He shot back at Church. When I look at the map today and see the weakness of the power of this country, that is what shocks me. Another member of the committee, Robert Morgan of North Carolina, turned that argument on its head by noting that what shocked him was the violation of individual rights represented by the mail opening program. Senator Walter Mondale of Minnesota further observed that the Houston Plan revealed, and I'm quoting, an enormous, unrestricted, paranoid fear about the American people. Angleton's retort, it was not, in my view, paranoid. Senator Richard Swiker of Pennsylvania zeroed in on my final question to Angleton in the pre-hearing staff deposition. At this point, the former CI chief went into full retreat, and Angleton said, that should not have been said. I would say I'd been rather imprudent in making those remarks. I withdraw the statement. That was the extent of his defense, and it came across as unsatisfactory and even lame. Angleton was a remarkable individual in many ways, and during his tenure as head of the CIA staff, no Soviet mole had penetrated the CIA. Yet here he was, an object of ridicule in a nationally televised hearing. Well-deserved, too, his critics would no doubt reply, pointing to his many counterintelligence excesses that had led to tragic outcomes for individuals improperly accused of disloyalty. These mistakes and the mail opening program obviously warranted sharp criticism. Yet lost in this critique against him were the many good things Angleton had done to emphasize counterintelligence. Lost, too, was the importance to U.S. intelligence of his contacts throughout Europe and in Israel. And sometimes his relations with the FBI were quite effective at the liaison level, even though Hoover and Helms may not have been speaking to one another. Lost, too, was his warm personality, his great personal charm, and his impressive erudition. A few days before the hearing, Angleton had complained to me, and I'm quoting him, "The country is going to hell. There is no interest in national security these days, and your committee," as if it were my committee, is a manifestation of this. I could remember all of the hours I had spent with him, and with Tom Charles Houston, and Richard Helms, and a number of other people. These were not evil men by any stretch of the imagination, but they did have a more pronounced fear of the enemy than did most people. For Houston, the enemy was the scraggly dressed anti-war protesters. For Angleton, it was the KGB as a zero-sum adversary around the world. During the Cold War, this idea of the enemy, the sinister force, was used to deny freedom in the United States. It was not the first time we'd heard such arguments, nor would it be the last. A few weeks after his ordeal on Capitol Hill, Angleton berated the Church Committee publicly for, and I'm quoting, a type of McCarthyite hearing in which the denigration of the intelligence community was its goal, unquote. I presumed that that would be the end of our little chats down at the Army-Navy Club, but to my surprise, a couple of weeks later, he telephoned me and invited me back I guess he figured at least if he couldn't strangle church, maybe he could strangle me, I don't know. After lunch, Angleton compared the Church Committee investigation to the pillaging of intelligence services in countries that had been overrun and occupied by a foreign power. And I'm quoting him, "Only we have been occupied by Congress, with our files rifled, our officials humiliated, and our agents exposed." When the committee published its final report in May of 1976, Angleton responded with a formal written critique. He deplored, and I'm quoting him, "the now shaky and harassed CIA and the straitjacket Senator Church and the committee staff have brazenly tailored for it," unquote. Although he conceded that the intelligence agencies, and again I'm quoting, did engage in some illegal and ill-advised operations, he went on to underscore that these were by no means altogether reprehensible when weighed in light of the national security considerations prevailing at the time. A month later, he told a newspaper reporter that the damage wrought by the Church Committee was, quote, "very far-reaching," unquote, and that Senator Church had been, quote, "dishonest and demagogic." Early in the investigation, Frank Church had said on a Sunday talk show that the CIA was acting like a rogue elephant on a rampage. Now, in this interview, Angleton said, "History will show Church was the rogue elephant." I soon moved to Georgia and never saw Jim Angleton again, although he telephoned me periodically over the next several years, usually to fulminate about the state of security in America. One afternoon in 1987, he called me with a longer than usual diatribe against Frank Church, who had died 3 years before of pancreatic cancer. He rambled on for a half hour, then suddenly ended the conversation with the remark, "It ain't over till the fat lady sings." Now, that wasn't exactly what I was expecting from this erudite scholar, but that's what he said. I suppose what he meant with this uncharacteristically trite phrase, that eventually the merits of his struggle against Soviet intelligence operations would be acknowledged. A few weeks later, on May 12th, Jim Angleton died of lung cancer. He was buried in Morris Hill Cemetery in Boise, Idaho, just a little ways away from Senator Frank Church. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Johnson. And now we turn to Alek Kugan. Mr. Kugan is a retired KGB Major General. He attended Leningrad State University, was recruited by the KGB for foreign intelligence work, serving in the first Chief Directorate. Undercover as a journalist, he attended Columbia University as a Fulbright Scholar in 1958, and then worked as a Radio Moscow correspondent at the United Nations in New York, conducting espionage and influence operations. From 1965 to 1970, he served as Deputy Resident and Acting Chief of the Residency at the Soviet Embassy in Washington. Kugan, the youngest general in the history of the KGB, served as the head of worldwide foreign counterintelligence. He retired in 1990 and became a public critic of the communist system and the KGB. That year, he ran successfully for the parliament of the USSR, and from that post, he continued his attacks on the KGB abuses. In 1995, he accepted a teaching position at Catholic University of America and currently resides here in the Washington area, and it's a great pleasure to welcome him to our conference. Alek, you have the floor.
Well, thank you for the introduction, and I'm really thrilled to attend this conference and talk about the old days. Indeed, doesn't happen very often. But let me tell you why the Angletons' sort of personality fascinated me. I was his counterpart on the opposite side. He ran the foreign counterintelligence, so did I. Before I was transferred to the domestic service and to my native city, St. Petersburg, I was fully in charge of foreign operations across the world, from Australia to Argentina, and of course the United States was at that time enemy number one. No more, it's target number one these days. The experience as a foreign counterintelligence chief really taught me so many things. So many things. Let me tell you, I was a totally ideologically motivated young man. When I joined the KGB, Joseph Stalin was still alive, and I was inspired by his greatness. And though my father, when he learned about my desire to become a KGB officer, he himself worked briefly, I mean, not briefly, but in a position of a security guard for the local party leadership. He told me, don't join that organization. It's a dirty work. I said, come on, you've been working for them for decades. Yeah, that's why I tell you, it's a dirty work. Well, kids, seldom listen to their parents' advice. So I joined the KGB and indeed spent 6 years in studying all sorts of, of course, languages, English, German, Arabic, everything related to the Western world and the Arab Muslim world. And when I graduated, finally, I came to Columbia University School of Journalism, and I was featured in the New York Times in the Man in the News because I was elected, the first Soviet ever elected to the Students' Council of Columbia University. That was made headlines at the time. Well, anyway, I spent here in the United States 10 productive years running and recruiting and running a number of sources with access to classified information. And, finally, the time came in 1970. After New York and Washington, I was summoned back to Moscow and became deputy and just a few months later, chief of foreign counterintelligence, a work similar to that of James Angleton. Well, unlike James Angleton, we had, like everything in Russia is oversized. I supervised some 700 officers and technical personnel, total number of my organization, and we had more than 500 sources, foreign sources. 2/3 of them were members of foreign intelligence, counterintelligence, and police organizations from, I say, Australia to, of course, the United States, and you name it. My encounter with the subsequent leadership in the Soviet intelligence, was perhaps one of the reasons why I agreed to participate in this program. The man who reminded me so much of Angleton was Vladimir Krychkov, the chief of the Russian intelligence, a party hack who spent some time with Yuri Andropov, the future chairman of the KGB in Hungary. And when he did come to Moscow, Andropov invited him, and within months, he was just appointed chief of the intelligence. He knew nothing about intelligence, but, does it matter? In some countries it does not, in Russia, for instance. And he would try to, introduce his own style of running the show, and he bumped into some professionals like myself who would raise doubts about his decision. That irritated him, obviously, and at some point he came to a conclusion that my disobedience is perhaps motivated not so much by my personality, but by some ugly forces way behind when I went to Columbia University. And the other guy who did go to the same place was Alexander Yakovlev. At that time, he would also become a Politburo member, a senior official of the Soviet system, and we were friends And that's when a great idea of conspiracy dawned on Khrushchev. These two guys, Yakovlev and myself, were recruited by the CIA in 1959. And from that moment on, they would move up, and, well, are about to grab power and install American, a pro-American, system. That was, in essence, his philosophy. When I, after Khrushchev convinced himself, and Andropov was reluctant, but before I left for St. Petersburg, my native city, Leningrad, Andropov told me, don't worry, it will take just a year or two. I pledge you will be back. But the other guys believed that I was indeed an American spy. And while in St. Petersburg, for 7 years instead of a year and a half, Andropov by that time passed away, so, Khrushchev ran the show. I took note that I'm followed, that I'm bugged. I lived in a luxury apartment. I would see the guys from the surveillance standing at the corner in the morning, and if I would cross the bridge, in the Neva River, I would see, well, after all, I had some experience with the FBI and other organizations. I would see some guys following me. One time I stopped, turned around, and said, listen, what are you doing? What are you following me? He said, well, come on, we have orders, you understand. I said, all right, okay. I didn't know that. Well, perhaps there was also an attempt to link me to the United States in one way or another. I met a young lady. She worked for the KGB. She would bring me some papers to sign, and I thought she was very pretty. And at then some point, she said, listen, why don't we meet outside the office? I said, well, okay. I was married, though, but my wife was in Moscow at the time, so I thought nothing wrong. So we did meet, and then she would say, oh, by the way, I'm just about to have a new job at Pan American office. Pan American Airlines. Would you be interested in connection with Pan American Airlines? I say, through you? Yeah, I will hug you, I will kiss you, but what do you mean? Well, maybe you would be interested in Pan American in some different way. I said, well, not really, not at this time. So they were trying to push me into some sort of, and then my first source, American, who I recruited in 1959, he was an American of Russian background. He worked for Thiokol Chemical Corporation. That was a manufacture and research in, hard kind of a solid fuel for missiles. And then when I met him, he was practically a volunteer. I made a few moves, and, well, just friendly stuff. And next time he brought, all the papers and samples of solid fuel. And I said, I work for you. Well, I scratched my head, said, all right, I'll check with my bosses. The bosses say, oh, he's an American plant or something. But other guys in Moscow said later, well, it's unlikely that Americans would share with us that kind of stuff. That was very sensitive material in this missile, in this race in space and all this stuff. Well, anyway, he became one of my first source, and he was very good operationally. But at some time, it's not my fault. He was a leftist, a peacenik of sorts, also. And, the FBI or whoever, the police in New York got interested in him, and afraid that he may be, investigated as a source of the Soviet intelligence, he fled to Europe using Air France, which did not have to report its passenger list to the local U.S. authorities at the time. By Air France to Paris, and through Paris came to the Russian embassy, identified himself, flown to Moscow, given, great welcome, great job, and, started a new life in Russia. His wife, a Chinese PhD in history, but born in China, daughter of a vice president of the Chinese Academy of Sciences, by the way. So she joined him in Moscow, and everything was good, all settled. I'm traveling again. And this is when I say Khrushchev took over, and his idea was, this is all a trick. This guy from the United States with the solid fuel, that is probably a fake. So they started investigating him just to prove that he was an American spy. It was obsession, I say, just like James Angleton in a sense, you know. Well, they found no proof, but they still put him in jail for violation of currency regulations. At that time, you know, changing dollars for rubles was a crime of sorts, you know. So they put him in jail, and I was summoned by Andropov, KGB chairman, and he said, listen, you know this guy. Why don't you meet him in jail and just tell him, let him admit that he was in fact an American spy. Just, you know, all these money violations, that's a pretext, you understand? So can you imagine? 20 years later, I meet this man in a cell, solitary confinement, and he comes in, you know, and I'm saying, oh, hello, my friend. I embrace, hug him, and say, listen, you must tell the truth. You cheated us all. You were FBI guy. You planted false, you know, stuff to our people. When he heard that, you know, I never forget that. He yelled at me, you are idiots, KGB, and all. I hate you all. I'll better kill myself. And then he broke down, and I hugged him, embraced him, went to Andropov, and said, no, this man is innocent. And that's when Andropov said, well, you better learn something about Russian life. That's how I went to Leningrad. And that's where I had all these, you know, surveillance and all this stuff, trying to prove that I was an agent of a foreign power. Well, as you know, that whole story failed, but Khrushchev never gave up. As you know, when the Soviet system was on the eve of the break, I mean, mounting pressures of public opinion, Khrushchev, tried to stage a coup. I mean, that was in 1991. I mean, a coup against Gorbachev's power. And, well, of course, Yeltsin at that time emerged as a serious political figure. And Khrushchev failed because no one, with the exception of a dozen or so, top Russian military party leaders, no one followed him. The coup was a total failure. I mean, because he overestimated the clout, the influence, and power of the KGB. The Soviet system was getting, I mean, to its final exit. And this is where Khrushchev miscalculated and got in jail. In fact, he spent 2 years in jail, finally wrote a letter from jail begging pardon and saying that was the greatest stupidity and, I mean, of his own. And he was eventually pardoned and died in peace in Moscow several years later. Well, these comparisons are important because, unfortunately, in the history of all nations, we bump into people who may be, viewed as mad, crazy individuals. Well, there's a current story. I will just give my own thought about it. In Syria today, President Assad, let me tell you, the Syrian regime from times immemorial, at least from my old days when I studied Arabic, they were all friends of the Soviet intelligence. And, no wonder Russia is so adamant to let the regime fall down. You know, they tried everything. Well, they get the United Nations involved. Well, in Libya, in Egypt, things fell apart, and, you know, different regimes. Not in Syria. Syria, for the Russians, it's a kind of a, not a jumping ground, but at least some of the final pieces of something pro-Soviet where they feel at least secure. Because the Russians are so insecure today. After the collapse of the USSR, well, with all these Baltic states, Ukraine, Asia becoming independent states, it's Russia proper, which is now in trouble. Don't forget we have, well, thousands and thousands of Muslims. I mean, the Chechens, well, that's a war has been going on for quite some time. Kabardians, Balkars, and perhaps more important, the Tatars inside Russia, a few hundred miles east of Moscow, the Tatar Autonomous Republic. If they really accept more, the faith of of their ancestors, and, well, step forward, Russia may simply disintegrate. This is something which you have to understand, and understand why so Mr. Putin today, my former subordinate, by the way, is so nervous about all these crowds of people shouting, all these, demonstrations and public protests. This is what Russia is on the move. It's very important to understand. And the younger generation of Russians, those who do not want to emigrate, don't want to look for jobs somewhere in Australia or in the United States, by the way, is now tough in allowing guys coming from Russia, because of the new immigration laws. But the younger generation have been also losing interest, and it's very important to keep them inside the country, because the future of the country essentially lies with them, not with some madman or just jerks like Khrushchev. Well, I do not want to talk about James Angleton in the same way, but this mentality, eroded in some ways, and suspicious, distrustful. This what may really lead to the end of the world before it it goes down anyway, as they say.
Thank you so much, Alek. We now have the great privilege of having one of this country's leading national security journalists with us. Rounding out this panel, David Martin is the CBS News national security correspondent, having covered the Pentagon and the State Department since 1993. During that time, he has reported virtually on every major defense, intelligence, and international affairs story for CBS Evening News, as well as for other broadcasts, including 60 Minutes and 48 Hours. During the invasion of Afghanistan and the war in Iraq, his in-depth knowledge of how the State Department, the intelligence community, and the military operate, both on the battlefield and Washington, positioned him as the big picture reporter for CBS News, utilizing his own sources and reports from CBS News correspondents in the region around the world, as well as in Washington. He explained and assessed the military strategies and operations for viewers. He has received several Emmys for his work, Emmy Awards, as well as the Alfred DuPont Columbia University Awards. He also received in 2004 the Joan Barone Award for Excellence in Washington-based national affairs and public policy reporting. He's the author of Wilderness of Mirrors, an account of the secret wars between the CIA and the KGB, and Best Laid Plans, the inside story of America's war against terrorism. It's a great pleasure to have you with us. You have the floor.
Thank you. As a reporter for the AP, I covered that hearing that Alek was describing, and afterwards I asked Angleton, why were you so spaced out? And he said he had over-medicated that morning. I think he was afraid of having to go to the bathroom and not being able to excuse himself, and so he took something to handle that, and it discombobulated him.
Another inside scoop from David Martin. There we go.
I first heard the name James Angleton on the night of December 21st, 1974. I was working the night desk for the AP a job which entailed getting the first editions of the New York Times and the Washington Post and chasing any stories that were in there that the AP didn't have. And the editions for December 22nd was the edition in which Seymour Hersh published his expose of domestic spying by the CIA, and that was where I saw Angleton's name for the first time. I was sure he would have an unlisted number, but there he was in the phone book on North 33rd Street in Arlington. I can't remember if it was myself or someone else who made the first call, but I do know that I spent more than an hour talking to him that night. I didn't get anything out of him about domestic spying, but that was the first of many phone calls and subsequent visits to his home, and yes, lunches at the Army-Navy Club. Angleton turned out to be my ticket to the big time, or at least my ticket off the night desk at AP. Following leads he gave me, I started breaking stories for the AP that got me assigned full-time to covering all the subsequent investigations launched as a result of that first New York Times story. That would include, of course, the Church Committee, and just for the record, Locke Johnson was a lousy source. Like everyone else, I was mesmerized by Angleton. My father had been an analyst for the agency, but this was my first exposure to the dark side. And Angleton exceeded all my fantasies of a burnt-out spook. He smoked and drank too much. He seemed to speak with a perpetual slur. He had these two hobbies of fly fishing and orchid growing, which just seemed like perfect metaphors for the spy business. And he always intimated that he and only he knew the real story behind whatever topic was under discussion, and he sure as hell wasn't going to share it with me. And so just because some of the things he did tell me, like the Sino-Soviet split being a hoax, didn't make sense, that only meant that my mind just couldn't cut it in the world of counterintelligence. At first, I couldn't figure out why he was devoting so much time to me, a lowly wire service reporter. Eventually, it dawned on me that since he was now unemployed, having been fired by Bill Colby, he was spending his time running me and about a dozen other reporters as unwitting agents of his influence. By the time it occurred to me that he just might be using me, I had already parlayed my relationship with him into a contract to write a book about another of the CIA's great cold warriors, a man named Bill Harvey, whose name I first heard from Angleton. So I was, you might say, a monster created by Angleton, which of course is more than a little ironic given how the book turned out. I can remember very clearly going to the home of a man named George Kieswalter, who is perhaps the CIA's most famous case officer. And Kieswalter, too, was a burnt-out case. He was drinking vodka tonic at 11 in the morning. Unprompted, he lit into Angleton as a man who had no qualms about ruining the careers of loyal CIA officers on the flimsiest of evidence that they might be a Soviet mole. I tried to track down some of Angleton's victims, but at that point I didn't have any luck. But then I came across a man named Claire Edward Petty, a longtime CIA officer who was retired and living in Annapolis. And just a brief aside about Ed. He died last year, and I learned from reading his obituary that as a young soldier in World War II, he had gone ashore at Normandy. The last time I talked to him was several years ago, and he was weeping because his grandson, an Army officer, had been killed in Iraq. And both he and his grandson are now buried at Arlington National Cemetery. Ed was not a burnout case. He loved his wife. He went sailing on the Chesapeake Bay and had no detectable grudges. And the only addiction I could spot was needlepoint, which is, of course, another perfect metaphor for that line of work. And it was Ed who led me into the wilderness of mirrors. Ed had served as a member of Angleton's counterintelligence staff, and during his last years at the agency took a crack at finding the mole. And for those of you who don't know how this story ends, Ed eventually concluded that Angleton himself was the mole, and that he had initiated the Great Mole Hunt as a means of sabotaging operations against the Soviet Union, at the same time casting suspicion on everybody but himself. So imagine being a 30-something reporter and suddenly being handed a story which out le carré. I thought I had found the key to the last 20 years of history. Ed had a encyclopedic recall. He would make notes of the subjects he wanted to cover in each of our meetings, and then he would just methodically go through them. And we would break after 3 hours, and I would come back again on another day. And he guided me through the wilderness, giving me chapter and verse on spy case after spy case. And it was actually better than having access to the files, because every time I got lost, he could simply stop, slow down, and bring me up to speed again. For whatever reason, he confided in me as no source ever has before or since. He even told me about the breaking of the KGB code, which at the time was one of the most closely held intelligence operations ever. He even told me the code name, Venona, which is, of course, now well known to intelligence buffs, but at that time had never seen the light of day. And it was from Ed I first learned that the Venona decrypts had led the FBI to all the big spy catches of the 50s. This was breathtaking stuff for someone of my generation. I came of age during the Vietnam War, the Pentagon Papers, and Watergate, and just assumed government was lying about everything, and of course they framed Rosenberg, and of course they framed Hiss. And here comes Ed Petty turning that all on its head, and then topping it off by telling me Angleton was the mole. I'm not going to try to recapitulate Ed's case against Angleton, except to say that it turned Angleton's doublethink into triplethink. I can remember the moment when I finally started to get my dim mind around what he was trying to tell me, and it was literally one of these, wait a minute, are you saying what I think you're saying? And he was. But one thing I could get my mind around was that if I wrote a book saying that James Angleton was a mole, he might sue me, which would prove ruinously expensive, and the only way I could defend myself would be to give up Ed Petty, and I couldn't do that. But I could write a book about the Great Mole Hunt and report that at the end of it all, Ed Petty had come up with this case against Angleton. You didn't have to believe that Angleton was the mole to believe that his hunt for the mole had been more damaging than any real mole could have been. In other words, the emperor of counterintelligence had no clothes. I wrote that more than 30 years ago. In the intervening years, we've had real moles discovered in both the CIA and the FBI. None of them go back far enough to have been the ones that Angleton was looking for. And the damage they did was measured in operations blown and lives lost. Angleton's damage was not measured in lives lost, but in careers ruined and operations stymied. The officers who fell under suspicion had been screwed, but they were still alive. Yuri Nasenko had been screwed, 1,277 days in solitary confinement while the agency sweated him. But screwed isn't dead. So Angleton was not as damaging as any mole could have been, but he did, with his suspicions, tie the CIA in knots for a full decade. So what drove Angleton? The pop psychology answer is that having been duped by his good friend Kim Philby, he was prepared to believe that anyone, no matter how charming and upstanding, could be a mole. Philby defected to the Soviet Union in 1963. 1963, of course, corresponds to the time frame when Anatoly Golitsyn was telling Angleton there's a mole in here somewhere. It's probably too simplistic to say that Angleton was just trying to make up for Philby, or that he was simply paranoid, although either or both of those may be true. There certainly were grounds for paranoia. I mean, the Venona transcripts revealed that the Soviets had penetrated every American institution worth penetrating in the 30s and 40s. But I would argue that the spy game had fundamentally changed since then. The Venona codebreak brought KGB operations in the United States to a screeching halt. Every agent who was mentioned in those cables, either by real name or cryptonym, was either arrested or had to be considered blown. So the KGB had to start all over again from scratch. Only by this time, the Soviet Union had been revealed for the brutal police state it was. So the KGB no longer had the ideological pull that brought in so many recruits back in the day. But Lord knows they were still trying to recruit spies. And if ideology didn't work, then maybe money and blackmail would. So was Angleton the mole? Well, now that he can no longer sue me, I'm free to say what I think, and I think we should forget the mole business. At various times, other CIA officers were brought in to examine Petty's case against Angleton, and none of them bought it. In the end, I think we should just think of it as a delicious piece of irony of seeing Angleton hoisted by his own petard of doublethink. I thought at the time that Angleton was drawn to doublethink by the sheer intellectual attraction, the desire to be able to play the game on one more level than anybody else. But I think the fundamental problem was much more prosaic. Angleton had been allowed to remain chief of counterintelligence for way too long. He had become like J. Edgar Hoover, a power unto himself who no one dared challenge because of fear for what he might have on them. Now, I'm a fine person to be saying that Angleton stayed too long. I've been covering the Pentagon for CBS for nearly 30 years. So I'm begging you, don't tell anybody at CBS I said that. After Angleton left the agency, a longtime CIA officer named Cleve Cram was brought in to write a history of Angleton's 20-year tenure as chief of counterintelligence. Cleve was working on that study at the same time I was working on my book. And although he encouraged me and seemed to agree with me about Angleton, he never told me much about his own work. It remains classified, and I only know the title of one of the chapters, What Angleton Thought. Wouldn't I like to read that chapter? Although it would probably make my head explode. Maybe someday the CIA's historical office will declassify it as it has done with the Venona cables. In an essay he wrote for the CIA's in-house publication, Studies in Intelligence, Cleve included a footnote in which he said he had interviewed Angleton in connection with his own review of Angleton's work, but ended the interviews when it became apparent Angleton's judgment and veracity could no longer be trusted. A man whose judgment and veracity cannot be trusted is not a man you want running a major division of the CIA. Angleton had leads galore, thanks to Gallitzin, but he had no real evidence. Yet his theories of penetration and disinformation were allowed to dominate the CIA for a full decade. At the very least, Angleton needed some adult supervision, and that would have been provided by the directors of the CIA, and in particular, Richard Helms, who was DCI from 66 to 73, and before that, director of operations, years when the mole hunt was in full cry and operations against the Soviet Union were stymied. Obviously, a CIA director doesn't have time to hunt for moles. he has to trust someone else to do it, and Helms trusted Angleton, which meant he pretty much just let him have his way. At some point, it's a director's responsibility to look at the costs and benefits, and Helms just never got around to that until way too late in the game. So what was Angleton's legacy? I think it's unfair to practice retroactive morality on James Angleton. He served at a time when almost everyone believed that the U.S. and Soviet Union were involved in a life and death struggle. Between the time Golitsyn defected in 1961 and Nosenko defected in 1964, there was a little thing called the Cuban Missile Crisis, not to mention the assassination of a president by a man who had lived in the Soviet Union. That's the context you have to judge Angleton in. But that doesn't change the fact that he was wrong. He was wrong about the Sino-Soviet split. He was wrong to trust Golitsyn. He was wrong about Nosenko's bona fides. I know there are people today who still believe Angleton was right, and I'm sure they have information to bolster their case. But it's going on 50 years, and the weight of history says Angleton was wrong. I doubt there's ever going to be another Angleton, which is probably good news for intelligence services, bad news for reporters who cover them. Even if someone with his unique personality were to come along again, he could not amass that kind of secret power. He would run afoul of congressional oversight, or he would just be rotated out of his job as chief of counterintelligence. As I said in the book, Angleton was a singleton.
Thank you very much. All right, we'll have about an hour, 45 minutes or so for Q&A. Who's first? Over here. Please, again, wait for the microphone and state your name and affiliation, if you like.
Mark Stout from the International Spy Museum. My question's for David Martin. If I heard you correctly, and maybe I was reading too much into it, you said back when you were you'd been talking with Petty and you were writing your book that you didn't want to write in your book that Angleton was a mole because you didn't want to lose a lawsuit. Should I read into that you actually seriously entertained the idea at the time that he really was, that perhaps you believed it? And if so, can you sort of, for those of us for whom the whole proposition sounds so crazy, can you just put me inside your mindset a little bit at that time?
Well, yeah. I mean, yeah. When I said I thought I had the key to the last 20 years of history, I thought that because, Angleton was the mole, that explains everything. So after I had that information, by then I was working at Newsweek, and we were going to publish this in Newsweek. But, we had to find out what became of Petty's report. And our bureau chief at the time, a guy named Mel Elfin, had a friendship or relationship with Richard Helms, who was then retired from having been ambassador to Iran and had an office downtown. And so I briefed Mel on the case, and Mel went over for one of his regularly scheduled little seances with Richard Helms and cold-cocked him with this. And Richard Helms wasn't director of CIA for nothing. He had his feet up on the table. This is as Mel described it to me. He had his feet up on the table, just lazy afternoon. And Mel hit him with the question, and Helms said, "I got to take a leak." and so he went out and obviously collected himself and came back in and said there was nothing to it. Once you start looking at somebody, you always find funny stuff, and we never thought there was much to it. Well, I wanted to try somebody else, and I don't know if this person's still alive, so I'm not going to mention his name. But I flew across the country to talk to this guy on a pretext. Walked into his office at a major corporation and cold-cocked him. And he started to kick me out of his office. And I said, you know, I came all the way out here. He said, that's your tough luck, buddy. But then he reconsidered. And he gave me, you know, a more considered explanation, which is that Bill Colby just didn't buy it. It was just, you know, it was Angleton squared. It was everything he didn't like about Angleton. And so the Petty's report went nowhere. I since have found out that they brought a guy named, I think his name is Ed Crutchfield. Is that? It was a long time close associate of Helms in to look at the case, and right. And then, you know, Cleve Cram wrote this history, but, oh, by the way, why don't you just see what you think of Petty's case? So I became, you know, I was deliberately, just for legal purposes, neutral about it in the book, but over time, and particularly over this span of time, with all the people that we now can talk to from the other side, you know, I've just dropped it as a thesis at all.
Thank you. Over here.
Karen DeWeesha, the Wilson Center. I have a question for Alek Kugan, and I appreciate the Christian you're having someone who looks at these things from the other side. Since you brought up a couple of people who are still alive, Khrushchev and Putin, I wonder if, and I assume you don't think they're going to sue you. I wonder if I could ask about a detail that recently came up. In Masha Gessen's new book, she alleges that Yuri Drozdov, who was Major General in 1990, head of the illegals, had been and was an illegal in Germany and involved in the Rudolf Abel, Gary Powers spy exchange. He was the head of the team that took out Amin in Afghanistan. That he went to Berlin and met Putin in 1990. And that there was some connection in terms of Putin being involved with perhaps the 91 coup, but some kind of his next assignment. And another set of documents that's just come out, published 2 days after her death, Marina Salyer, who just died of a massive heart attack in St. Petersburg, someone whom I'm sure you know, knew. She published all of her documents on Facebook. And in one of the documents, there's an order signed by Putin giving the authority for a company called Counterintelligence to import meat into St. Petersburg, paid for by the Russian government, by Pavlov, approved it. And that meat went to Moscow to be held and in Moscow and to be released after the August coup so that there would be food on the shelves. I'm just wondering, did you have information about this? Is this true? Was the American side following this at all? It's very, very late to have this kind of information come up. I'm just wondering what kind of view you have about it.
Well, Mr. Putin actually retired from the KGB in 1989 when he came back from Dresden. It was a highly unsuccessful career, so he landed in the Municipal Council of St. Petersburg, where his former teacher, Professor Sobchak, picked him up. Actually, Sobchak, who I knew pretty well, asked me if I could name someone from the KGB local office who he could rely on and just to have a link between him and the KGB. And I said, no, I don't know anyone reliable. Well, so he found his own students who used to be, and he made him an assistant on municipal affairs related to international trade. At that time, Russia was in a very bad shape in terms of food supplies, and Putin managed to, through, well, Russian oil and some rare metals, to organize a deal of, well, through Finland, of having food coming to Russia in exchange for Russian natural resources. And that made St. Petersburg a fairly well-off city, and people in Moscow who were still hungry. And Yeltsin himself said, what's going on? Why they do it better in St. Petersburg than in Moscow? And then he was told that there is a very enterprising guy who organized all that. He let him come to Moscow and help us. So Putin arrived to Moscow as deputy chief of Borodin. Borodin was the chief of the Kremlin business administration. Putin was put in charge as a deputy in charge of Russian property abroad. And that was the beginning of his career. I mean, in Moscow. But actually, what happened, just briefly, it's all nothing secret about it. One, Putin's family, Yumashevs, I mean, that's his son-in-law, was in trouble with some financial, deals, and they were facing charges from the prosecutor's office. And Putin, Yeltsin wanted to stop it, but the prosecutors, that was a new time for Russia, they would not listen to him. And Yeltsin could not remove the prosecutor general because that was the function of the Russian Duma, parliament. So Yeltsin was so frustrated, and at some point he talked to Putin, who was providing, supplies. Well, could we do anything about the prosecutor? I'm really sick and tired of him. And Putin said, well, no, kind problem, no problem. Yeah, so the prosecutor general was invited to a KGB rented apartment in Moscow with two young ladies. When he entered the apartment, they were confronted with, these materials. And that's when Yeltsin said, oh, Putin, he is a great guy. He knows how to handle things. That's true. It's all, recorded. It's not my imagination. And that's how he would become the prime minister, and later, but again, something which many people do not know, it's again on public record. 3 months before he passed away, Yeltsin was interviewed by the Russian media, and I say this interview is available. He was asked a question, now, Mr. President, as you look back at your career, what major errors of judgment do you think you made? And he said, oh, I had so many. Well, could you name a couple? And he said, okay, number one, the war in Chechnya. Number two, the choice of my successor, period.
All right, this is taking us quite far away from Angleton, so my hope is that some of the next questions will go back to the subject of the conference. Mr. Gerber.
Thank you, Burton Gerber. This is a question for you, Oleg. Can you tell us from your knowledge from inside the KGB, what was the true status of Nosenko as a defector or not? And what do you think when Pete Bagley tells us this morning that because from inside the authorities, wherever they are in Russia, he has information which seems to support that whole concept of Nosenko as a plant?
Well, let me tell you, in the old Soviet days, any defection by a sailor from a trawler or a stewardess from an airline was a scandal. It could not be tolerated. How could the Soviets, go for Russian propaganda and Russian mindset at that time? That was just unacceptable. So to think that a KGB officer with knowledge of, and he, by the way, was the son of the Minister of Shipbuilding Industry, if I'm correct, right, to defect to the West, that was most outrageous. I never remember in my life of this dimension of scandal inside. In fact, I was among those who were recalled from the United States, though I did not know him personally, but they said he knows so much he would finger you and others, and you better get out. So I did get out. Later I would come back anyway. I mean, again, on the diplomatic cover, though. That was and the Soviet system sort of collapsed. But in the new post-Soviet regime, they can resort to exactly what Angleton was suspected of. They would use polonium, they would use guns, they would shoot Politkovskaya, they would poison Litvinenko, they would do many other things. And by the way, in one of the books published in the United States by a former FBI agent, Ehringer, that's his name, right? Ehringer. He talks to one of the top officials in this former Soviet KGB in Moscow, and they're talking about all sorts of things, and including some assassinations. And the author of the book asks that former Soviet senior official, well, how come, some guys like Kugan are still alive and kicking? And the response was, had he lived in Europe, he would have been dead long time ago. But in the United States, we never killed anyone. And that's true. There was not one single individual, Soviet or Russian, murdered by the Soviet secret police, either in the old days or current days. Krivitsky, no, he was not killed. He jumped over from the... no, he was not killed. I know that. No. He was in a state of despair, and he committed suicide. No one pushed him down, as some claim.
All right. Gentlemen up front here, if you can please hold for the microphone.
Joel McCleary and a rank amateur.
No. Yes, please.
Joel McCleary and a rank amateur and a sea of experts. What I'm curious about, if we were to try to come to a consensus on what we've heard today, would it be all right for us to entertain this proposition that there was a period where Angleton, given what Mr. Andrews said, was actually very, very good and very, very productive for the country, and then he became the burned out case? And is that a general assumption that everybody holds here, or is there even dissent on whether in his earlier time, let's say into the late 50s, that even during that time period he was more a menace than he was effective?
Thank you. Who'd like to take that on?
I mean, my researches sort of began with the defection of Golitsyn in '61. So, and I think from the moment Golitsyn came over, he was a negative. Angleton was a negative, a net negative for the CIA. And before that, I just don't know enough.
Mm-hmm. I was simply trying to make the point that Angleton, like the rest of us, are very complex, and there are many sides to our personality, and that in our rush to condemn him, that we shouldn't forget about some of the things he did accomplish. And, after he left, as much as I like George Claris, who followed him, he was a terrific guy, I think there was a dispersal of the counterintelligence responsibility, and that hurt counterintelligence at the CIA and elsewhere. So his emphasis on the importance of counterintelligence was valuable. And I know this is controversial and people might disagree, but I do think that during some rough periods between the CIA and the FBI, Angleton maintained at a lower level some pretty good relationships over there that were helpful for the country. But the bottom line is Chris Andrews is exactly right. When someone believes wholeheartedly in the Sino-Soviet split, you've got to wonder.
Thank you. Bob Hathaway.
Thanks, Christian. Bob Hathaway here at the Center. I briefly alluded this morning to the fact that I wrote classified histories for the CIA for a few years and interviewed Angleton and Helms a number of times. It was briefly alluded to this morning, but the details weren't exactly right. Angleton was responsible for one of the greatest intelligence coups of the entire 1950s in getting the first copy that got to the West of Khrushchev's 1956 speech denouncing Stalin. This was a huge deal at the time, first to the intelligence community, and then as it became publicly known, more generally. So I think in answer to your question, I'm certainly not qualified to evaluate his performance throughout the 1950s, but at least in this one instance, he was widely regarded as having done something quite remarkable. I asked him one time point blank, this is perhaps 2 years before his death, I said, will you at long last reveal how you happened to get a copy of that speech? The assumption was he'd gotten it from the Israelis. And he looked at me and said, no. Richard Helms said some years after his retirement that during his time as DCI, one of the most important events for him, particularly in his relationship with the White House, was the accurate CIA assurances to Lyndon Johnson that the Six-Day War would be over very quickly and would result in an overwhelming Israeli victory. Johnson was under immense pressure to publicly side with the Israelis and to immediately commence an arms lift, and for reasons primarily related to relations with the Soviet Union, he didn't want to go there if he didn't have to, though of course he wasn't prepared to see the Israelis lose that war either. He came to rely on the CIA and that the Israelis are going to win, and they're going to win big time, and they're going to win quickly. And Helms always said this was a key point in establishing his relationship with this president, and as a consequence of that, Helms was then invited to the White House for lunch every week, and he felt that this was a big deal. There were a number of reasons why the CIA had the good intelligence on what was likely to happen during the Six-Day War. Angleton was one of the sources for Helms's confident assessment to Lyndon Johnson, not the only one, but one of them. And it was my sense that perhaps, at least in part because of this, and what a big deal this was for Richard Helms. Afterwards, and this gets back to Nosenko, he was really prepared to give Helms the benefit of the doubt. I think my sense was that Helms had doubts about Angleton's handling of Nosenko, at least by 67, 68. I think at one point in this time period, he ordered that Nosenko be released. And Angleton simply dragged his feet, as I recall, and I'm not sure about the details, as I recall, for several more years before Nosenko was brought back to a normal existence. Helms, for whatever reason, and maybe, as I say, connected to the 67 war, Helms simply never felt able or prepared or willing to pay whatever the political cost was to lean on Angleton. I think that gets back to, I think it was David Martin who said that at a minimum Angleton needed much more adult supervision than he ever got. I think at least at one point in the late 60s, Helms simply was not prepared to do this, even though he was being urged by others to do so.
Thanks, Bob. That's very helpful. Mark?
I just thought I'd comment very quickly on the speech by Khrushchev in '56, or the secret speech. Angleton told me during our meetings that he, in fact, had gotten a copy of that speech from Israeli intelligence, and that he had gotten the idea, along with his staff, that it should be doctored to make the Stalinist regime look even more heinous than the speech itself did, and then distribute the doctored speech throughout Eastern Europe. He claimed that he did that, but I think a lot of recent or subsequent research indicated that that never was done. That yes, he doctored it inside the CIA, but he was never allowed to distribute it. I don't think that ever happened. By the way, the last thing I think I said to you before was anyone who believed in the Sino-Soviet split you had to wonder about. I meant, of course, just the opposite. If you didn't believe in that, you had to wonder about the person.
Can I ask you, was there independent evidence that in the files that Angleton was the guy who got the speech?
Some of what I've written has been...
Microphone, Bob.
Some of this history of Helms's DCI has been declassified. Some of it hasn't. I wrote it. I'm one of two co-authors. I wrote it 25 years ago. I don't remember squat anymore. However, I did go back and read several of the chapters pertaining to Angleton just last night, the declassified portions of it. I never found any indication as to how Angleton had gotten it, but it was universally believed that he did.
That's it, right? Universally believed. There's no hard copy anyplace saying that he's the guy.
I don't want to say that. I never found any documentary evidence, but I think that clearly was part of the explanation why he was given free rein for so long.
I've just always been very suspicious of that story. And he always was so coy about it that just made me more suspicious.
All right, the gentleman in the center back.
Steve Winters again. I want to pose this question. If I'm old enough to do this, if I go back to that period of the church committee and that mentality of, oversight, and I hear the comments about how Angleton, responded to the committee, and it's very easy for me to side very strongly with the committee and, sort of dismiss this idea of a rogue element that thinks they can do things, in the national interest without perhaps observing the legalities. However, that's fine from a nostalgic point of view, but if I look at the last 11 years, obviously we have case after case after case where there's been a tremendous increase of surveillance, probably justified legislation, both retroactive and otherwise, to create a more secure thing, very much in the spirit of what it appears Angleton was saying in that testimony. So rather than going back into nostalgic 70s and pillaring Angleton as, you just don't belong in this attitude is unacceptable in 1970, whatever, actually, he seems to be very much in the mainstream of current thinking over the last decade and more. So why do we want to pillory him when his viewpoint is actually the one that's been adopted by the government wholeheartedly in the present?
Anyone like to react to that?
Well, would you mind clarifying that? What are you characterizing as his view?
Well, for example, the surveillance of telephone conversations by the major phone companies that was then retroactively decided they're not going to prosecute them, even though what they did was illegal back in the last decade. That being a specific example. But that mentality, you mentioned the opening of the mail back then, and we've got to watch the Americans, and we've got to watch anybody with these contacts or any suspicious person. That's the connection I'm trying to make.
Mm-hmm. Well, if you go into the Madison wing of the Library of Congress, you'll see etched on the wall a comment from James Madison, which he said, "Power, lodged as it must be in the hands of man, is ever liable to abuse." And I think that was what we found out during the Church Committee investigation, that even some good people strayed too far and abused their powers. And I think we found since the Church Committee that oversight, Senate Intelligence Oversight Committees and other forms of oversight have helped reduce that abuse of power, but certainly haven't eliminated it. And I would argue the second Bush administration is a good example in its use of warrantless wiretaps of an instance in which we returned to the same kind of horrors that the Church Committee uncovered back in 1975. Jefferson said you have to have constant vigilance if you want democracy, and I think that's what we have to have. We have to make sure that people who have power are constantly watched, or that power will be abused.
Thank you. There was somebody over here who had a question, but then I think he just left. So Ross Johnson.
Ross Johnson, Wilson Center. Just two comments. There's been discussion about the secret speech, and while Angleton may well have provided one copy that he got from the Israelis, the copies came out of Poland, and this was the version for the foreign communists. And there were multiple copies floating around through different channels. Some of that's already in the Frus volume, but no doubt it was a merit, but this may not have been the only source for the secret speech, Angleton's copy, if you will. The other comment is there was discussion this morning about the broader background of looking at communism that could have brought Angleton to the conclusion that the Sino-Soviet split is all a hoax. I just remind us of sort of the background here, and the common theme of sort of the international communist conspiracy, all orchestrated out of Moscow. And the closer you go back to 1960, the more voices you would have found wondering, this can't be for real, the Sino-Soviet dispute. I mean, go back to Don Zaguea's book and his work inside the agency and the disputes about all that. When you get 10 years out, it's kind of absurd. But at the time, the closer you are to the 60s, and it's not the only case. I mean, I just listening to that discussion, I recall there's an NIE from the 50s, the early 50s, on Yugoslavia. And in there you can find a footnote from at least two of the agencies that this isn't for real, the Tito-Stalin dispute. So there is that sort of mindset that over the years affected thinking. And again, by the time you get to the late 60s to conclude that the Sino-Soviet dispute is a hoax to fool us, that's absurd. But maybe this helps us understand some of the background that could have led an Angleton or others to that kind of conclusion.
Thanks, Russ. That's very helpful. The gentleman all the way in the back.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a comment on the getting the secret speech by Angleton, which it may well be that he got it from Mossad. That shouldn't be portrayed as a intelligence coup by Angleton. If the Israelis get the secret speech and they want to get it to the U.S. government because they know it's going to be useful for us and help their sort of advance their interests with us, they're going to give it to whoever their point of contact is, who at that point in time was James Angleton. So we shouldn't make it as an intelligence coup that James Angleton, if indeed he got the secret speech from Mossad. I mean, whoever Mossad was talking to, they would have given it to. So to put it in perspective.
Thanks, Barry. That's helpful. Yep.
Hi, I'm Carl Colby. I have a question for Locke. You seem to, I'll be a bit of a contrarian, but you seem to imply that the culture now accepts that the church committee was all well and good, and it was effective, and it changed really the culture of oversight, etc. In the last 4 months, I've traveled the United States showing my film, in which really thousands of people have seen it. And I'm struck, actually, and I tried to be very fair, but I'm struck by how the audiences, almost to 9 out of 10, will leave the section on the church hearings and the Pike hearings that it was like a witch hunt, that my father was just vilified and was just tarred and feathered. And I was a bit surprised by that. And I've talked to Fritz Schwartz and other people about this, and I'm going to see him next week. And what's interesting to me is that there's no outrage today about many of the covert actions that are being sort of promulgated. This president has got his hands full. He's probably signing more findings than any president and ordering more covert action than any president since the Kennedys. And there's no public outcry. And it's quite interesting to me that, do you see this, and if you relate it back to the period of the 70s and the sort of divide between my father and Angleton, I mean, has the culture changed? I mean, will there be accountability? Because, again, I'm surprised. I tried to be very fair, but when you see Ron Dellums, Otis Pike, Frank Church just nailing him, and then I listen to tens of thousands of people after the screenings, and they tell me, my God, how did you survive this? And why was there this abuse heaped on him? It's quite interesting culturally, and I wanted you to sort of address that, because in the end, we can talk about Angleton and his disconnect, let's say, with, as you said, when he finally did testify. But, where's the outrage now? doesn't seem to exist at all. Just if I'd like your comments about that.
I think you make some good points, Carl, but I would say that your father and the Church Committee and the Pike Committee and the Rockefeller Commission created a sea change in attitudes about intelligence. I would say it's the difference between black and white, night and day. Before the investigations of 1975, there was virtually no oversight. And I think intelligence was viewed as an exceptional case. It didn't have to be part of the regular American government. It didn't necessarily, in all cases, have to honor the laws. And I think after the Church Committee investigation, and the stance your dad took as well, that people realized that wasn't right, that the intelligence agencies had to be part of the American government, just like the Department of Agriculture. And I think one of the best testimonies that I could point to is every single DCI since that time, with the exception of William Casey, is on record as saying that oversight is a really good thing. It helps share our responsibilities. It gives us insights to what the American people view as the bounds of tolerability. I am worried, though, about you, that some attitudes around the country don't really fully understand that. Although I spent a lot of time traveling around the country talking to student audiences, too, and most of them get it. They get the Madisonian principle that secret agencies, just like the rest of the government, need to be supervised. And I think that's gratifying. I've just finished a study on covert action, though, particularly its emphasis by the CIA, and we are now in a period of time when covert action has become the tail that wags the dog. We have more covert actions underway today, including some very lethal ones with the use of CIA drones, than we've ever had before. I used to think that the golden age of covert action, particularly paramilitary operations, was during the Reagan years, and after all, we did have a lot of them, and that would be the second highest peak. And then the third highest peak would be during the Korean War. And then the Vietnam period, we had a lot of covert actions, too, in support of our troops in Vietnam. That would be the fourth highest peak. But we are now in the highest peak when it comes to covert action. And at the same time, I don't think enough lawmakers on the Senate Intelligence Committee are taking their responsibilities seriously. There was a strong desire to be good overseers in the aftermath of the Church Committee investigations, and then that fell off. And then we had the Iran-Contra scandal. Then there was a reinvigoration of interest in oversight, and then it dropped off. So it's kind of cyclical, and unfortunately, I think we're in a down cycle right now.
You know, I think the point you make goes to the thing I was saying about it's unfair to judge Angleton on the basis of retroactive morality. Today's covert actions, particularly the lethal ones, become known almost in real time. So you're learning about them in the context in which they were conducted. All these things that happened in the 60s did not come to light until the 70s, and you learn about them in a totally different post-Vietnam context. I think if you had taken a vote in the United States, how many people think we should assassinate Castro in 1960? I mean, I think you would have gotten an overwhelming majority, but by the time you get to 1974, it's heinous.
Thank you. You had a question earlier.
Yep. Thanks. My name is Mike Weber. I'm a master's student at the Institute of World Politics in Washington here. And my question is about ideas and values about counterintelligence. I haven't seen it myself, but I understand that Israel has a statue for James Angleton, and they really revered and respected him. And I don't know of any other country that's done something similar to that, especially in the CI sphere. So my question is because of how James Angleton learned about counterintelligence overseas during World War II, were his ideas and values and methods about counterintelligence just not at par with what Americans expected about counterintelligence when he was head of counterintelligence in the United States afterwards? Was just, because the Israelis and the Brits, although have similar views, they do have slightly different approaches to counterintelligence, and they're willing to fudge sometimes civil rights and other things a little bit more, I think, than Americans would like to think. So I'm just curious to your thoughts about that.
Mm-hmm. Would like to address that.
Well, I would point out that Angleton learned, I think, the counterintelligence trade at the knees of the Brits and the Italians and some Jewish leaders in the West who were helping to fight the Nazis. And I think when he got involved in counterintelligence at the CIA, that he brought a lot of great methodology. that he had learned from these real pros who had been doing it a lot longer than the United States had ever been doing it. But then I think he got caught up in Cold War rhetoric, and I'm told that if you're a homicide officer and you're in a police department and you look at homicides every day, every week, pretty soon it does something to your mind. And I think when you're in counterintelligence for so long, it begins to warp your mind as well. So I think he got the CIA probably off to a good start in basic counterintelligence methodology, but then I think he began to stray.
Thank you. I think I'd like to call this session to a close, but let me thank our terrific three speakers, Locke Johnson, Alek Kugan, David Martin.